Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the monthly Conexxus webinar. And this month, we're very excited to have a couple of experts in security and compliance talking about penetration testing, how to test, and what matters most. And we've got Sam Van Steel and John Stickle, both from Coalfire. Just a little bit about the agenda today. Go over a couple housekeeping items, talk about the presenters, a little bit about Conexxus. We'll have the presentation, and then we'll have a little questions and answer section at the end. Just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available in approximately 30 days. It's available on YouTube in the Conexxus subscription and also in the Conexxus website. If you would like a copy of the slide deck, there is a survey link just for a few questions after the webinar is concluded. And if you complete the survey, you will be sent a link via email a couple days later with a link to the presentation. So hang tight until after the presentation is over, answer a couple survey questions, and you'll get a copy of the presentation deck. We do ask that participants ask questions via the question panel and the webinar interface. And please note vendor-specific questions. If you do have any suggestions or future webinars or suggestions in general or questions about Conexxus, you can email Conexxus at info@conexxus.org. Next slide, please. Today, our host is Ms. Allie Russell with Conexxus. I am your moderator. I'm Cara Gunderson. I'm the chair of the Data Security Standards Committee for Conexxus. And my day job, I am the point of sale manager at Citgo Petroleum. We're very lucky to have John and Sam with us from Coalfire. And Sam is a very active member of our Data Security Standards Committee. He's also one of our compliance and security subject matter experts. John is also definitely a subject matter expert and is a security consultant with Coalfire Labs. So, gentlemen, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Cara.
Next slide. Just a little bit about Conexxus. Conexxus is an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. They set standards for data exchange. They do security, mobile commerce. They set the technology standards for the petroleum industry in the United States. They provide a vision for emerging and technology and trends, and definitely an advocate for our industry. And that helps all of us when everyone is adopting the Conexxus standards. As merchants like myself, it helps when we want to adopt a certain type of technology and everybody's adhering to the Conexxus standards. It just makes it easier for implementation and development all the way around. Conexxus is derived mostly of volunteers like myself and Sam and John here that willingly give time and commitment to make sure that Conexxus is a strong organization and is a technology arm for the United States petroleum industry. Today, as I said, we're going to have the penetration testing, how to test what matters most. In April is the Conexxus annual meeting, so there is no monthly webinar. And then in May, we have an update on the QIR program. As we all know, that's the PCI QIR program, and that'll be given by Chris Bugalo of Control Scan. Now I'd like to turn this over to Sam and to John to talk about penetration testing and how to test what matters most. Thanks, gentlemen, and welcome.
Thanks, Cara, and welcome to everyone who's joined us. Appreciate you joining us on this Tuesday morning or perhaps afternoon, wherever you're dialing from. I am definitely honored here today to be joined by my colleague, John Stickle, who's one of our penetration testers and definitely an expert in his field. I've got the gift of gab, but he's got it where it matters most, which is in really putting his hands to the keyboard and really testing the systems, the applications, the networks, and the configurations that really drive enterprise today. So, John, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Sam.
Go in the right direction. So, really wanted to try to tailor a presentation for you guys that would help answer some very prescient questions around penetration testing. We've all encountered it in our roles, which is to say, I would imagine that whether it's by virtue of the applications and systems we manage, or based on the compliance frameworks that we all have to meet. There's generally a requirement within the security structure for penetration testing or pen testing. But yet there's still many misconceptions about what penetration testing is and isn't, and what it's what it's best used for, and what it perhaps does not address as part of a larger security program. So penetration testing, what is it? It's a human-based threat emulation. At its very core, those four words. It's driven based on actual experts like John, who are knowledgeable in a particular set of skills that allows them to emulate a threat. And threat is one of those words that we'll actually dive into here in a second to get a little bit more color on. And that emulation, of course, is as close to reality as possible in order to act as a threat actor or an adversary in your network or outside of your network or in person, whatever the case may be, and whatever the structure and scope of the penetration activities are defined to be. So this purpose of this activity is to, long and short of it, is to discover any exploitable security flaw before the bad guy does. So these, that's beyond that, there's a lot of discussion as far as what penetration testing is and isn't. We'll get into some of that with methodologies and activities, objectives, threats, and scope. But those scenarios and targets can often vary, but the penetration testing itself is essentially boils down to that. So why do we need penetration testing? What is its role in a security program? I don't think anyone would be surprised at the numbers. It's certainly been touted around our industry specifically, but to the economy at large. The breaches that are occurring due to vulnerabilities, these numbers, I believe, are somewhat telling from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report from 2017. 75% of those are outsiders, but 25% are internal actors. And that number may or may not come as a surprise to some folks on this call if you think about that for a minute, because most of our security controls and activities are targeted towards establishing a strong security barrier or boundary around the outside of our organization, whereas a good quarter of all actors may have privileged access already within your environment. Furthermore, there are additional breaches that are conducted by state-affiliated actors and criminal groups. Now, the tactics they use is also very interesting. Of course, obviously hacking, but the injection or the introduction of malware into an environment constitutes over half of the activities that you see. So when you see that the exploitations are occurring as a result of software that is able to perform many of these activities automatically, you realize that you really have to take a multi-pronged approach, both by employing both hackers that can emulate the human mind behind these threats, as well as strong software. And this is one area we've been investing in a lot, is the introduction of new open source platforms that are capable of emulating and simulating many of the common threats that, or identifying threats in an automatic and artificially intelligent manner. So a multi-pronged approach there is relevant. And of course, the tactics that involve leveraging human attacks, such as social attacks or weak passwords, are prevalent as well. And then finally, as you see the trending upward here, this espionage line, which is growing fairly consistently. Now, if you saw the dotted line is the actual year-over-year data. So this trend line is relatively muted with respect to the growth in espionage trends from 2015 to 2016. Whether that continues upward at that rate is anyone's guess. So financial threats, and these where the attacker actually has a financial motive, is going actually down relative to the total profile of threats, whereas other attacks that are targeting data that may not be financial in nature in terms of credit card data, but certainly is a threat to the organization, such as, again, espionage. That could be corporate, or it could be state-based espionage threats. So quickly, I want to run through a few just terms I think that are relevant in terms of risk, but also specifically related to penetration testing. So I've used this before if you've seen it, but this is a basic overview of the risk threats, or excuse me, risk terminology. An asset is any asset within your organization that you need to protect. I'm a PCI guy, so I'm always thinking about card data. as the asset du jour. Many of you may be in charge of your PCI compliance program, and you think of the threats for security as being contained strictly within that bucket of cardholder data or account data. But that asset could also be inventory. It could be corporate secrets. It could be processes. Certainly could be your brand reputation. And that every asset has some sort of intrinsic value to you as an organization and to your marketplace. So assigning value is part of the risk assessment process, and then also identifying all possible threats. So before we can really engage a penetration activity to protect that which matters most, that's our asset, we need to know what threats are existent, not necessarily those that we're exposed to, we'll get into that in a moment, but any threat that could possibly compromise or somehow diminish the value of that asset. Now, as we move forward through the overview here, we see that there, of course, are vulnerabilities, and that's where most of us think about when we talk about penetration testing. The adversary is any entity that we conceptualize. Could be, again, it could fall into any of those buckets we talked about earlier. Could be even an insider threat. So I've chosen to show the adversary outside the enterprise, but that adversary could very well be inside the enterprise already, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. An attack vector is any attack that they can wage against your organization. An attack surface is those systems or processes that they decide to attack or target. You see, it's a subset of the entire enterprise. It could be a large subset or it could be highly targeted. Of course, if that vulnerability exists, as we see that it does, then you are certainly, I guess, it's just a matter of time, right, where the attacks exist, that there'll be some sort of a breach. Breach is any ability to enter the network unauthorized. Sometimes we use the term breach when we talk about a data breach. Certainly the access point, maintaining state on an entry point is a part of a hacker's methodology. They certainly want to keep that access point into the environment so they can extract data if that's their objective. And they'll, of course, use that same breach point many times to do so. Sometimes it will be a completely different means by which to extract the data. It could be to put it on a local drive. It has nothing to do with the with the entry point, and then they collect it later. That could even be a physical drive, or it may be uploading it to a compromised server where they then extract the data from there. But whatever the case, the breach, the exploit, and exfiltration, I think those are terms that most folks are familiar with. Finally, I think as we address how to structure a penetration test, you need to identify where are the threats that are most important. Again, what matters most. So assets of extreme value certainly are the first on the list in any risk assessment, but also identifying what is the probability of a particular action taking place. If the asset is your point of sale systems and the probability is low, then the risk is low. But if the value of an item is low and the probability is high, it may also still have a relatively low impact. So you could say, well, my candy bar is sitting on the shelf in my convenience environment. It's very probable that a child will steal a candy bar from time to time. But what is the impact to your organization? It's very low. So placing armed guards on your candy bars or RFID tags or bars on the door or turnstiles to catch any juvenile criminal is certainly not the type of thing that you would expend your efforts in doing. And that's the overview of a risk assessment process. Of course, once you've identified impact, the next logical step is to implement the controls to shore up that vulnerability, thereby defeating the attack. So how does this play into penetration testing? So clearly the adversary is what we are emulating. As any penetration tester, whether it's Coalfire or your own staff or another agency, would simulate these attacks to compromise the vulnerability or exploit the vulnerability, access the asset. And sometimes the scope of the penetration test may end there. They may demonstrate that they had access to sensitive corporate details, or it may be that they would extract the data through an exfiltration process. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about structuring and scoping a penetration test. So again, I think we touched on this earlier, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but assets, when we talk about PCI DSS, the asset is cardholder data, or really account data, because account data includes also sensitive authentication data. Also, your CDE is an asset, right? So you're protecting the systems that protect the card data. Relative to PCI DSS as a compliance regime, I want to call everyone's attention to the recent penetration testing guidance that came out last September. Certainly a good read for discussing and understanding a little bit better as you're looking to shore up your own penetration testing activities or ensure the accountability to your chosen vendor, that there is, they're following that guidance. And the relevant areas that to PCI DSS are the internal, external, and then the segmentation testing, all under the requirement 11.2 and 11, all under 11.3. The applicable layers are network and application layer, where network also has requirements for wireless, rogue wireless detection, which is a type of labs or testing activity, not required to be performed by an external entity, but something very important to perform if you have wireless networks within your CDE. And finally, the systems themselves are targets or layers within the PCI DSS compliance regime for penetration testing. PCI also requires that you are using industry-accepted penetration testing approaches, and we'll cover some of those on this webinar today, and that it be performed quarterly and after any significant changes. And finally, whoever is performing your your penetration testing needs to have organization independence. And organizational independence doesn't mean they necessarily need to work for a third party. Coalfire is certainly happy to provide these services, as are many of our other those entities in this space. But you can actually bring together your own penetration testing team, as many of you know, to perform that. The important thing is that they meet industry-accepted penetration testing qualifications, which we'll talk about here later in our time today, as well as that they be organizationally independent from those that maintain the infrastructure. So having a penetration tester report to the same CTO that manages, or in smaller organizations, it may be your sysadmin. The sysadmin who manages the infrastructure cannot perform the actual penetration test, nor can they have the penetration tester report to them. And so these are things that need to be considered when you're performing your own testing. Of course, there are other forms of compliance that need to be addressed, such as any oil brand or distributor third-party contractual requirements, which we would categorize as being compliant insofar as it requires you to maintain a core level of security to meet certain standards within your contractual agreements, as well as your own information security policies and frameworks. If you manage security under a governance framework, those may be considered compliance requirements. But the reason I bring this up in this context of assets is to make sure that you are identifying the assets. Again, we talk about cardholder data a lot in the PCI world, but in this space, the important asset, I think, in my mind, is the reputation of the organization, which could be significantly impacted by many other attacks on the local convenience store. So that's why I brought up kind of the espionage and other actors where the trends are growing with respect to financial data, because those alternate attack vectors could also be highly risky to an organization who has focused entirely on card data, leaving some of their other crown jewels exposed, if you will, whether those be fuel controllers, car washes, the safety and physical security of your patrons. All of these are assets, if you will, that should be considered in a full risk assessment when engaging the penetration testing program. Adversaries, as we talked about earlier, could be inside or outside the organization. They could even be trusted third parties. So where you have vendors that are providing security services into your organization, just simply the existence of an attestation of compliance is great for meeting arbitrary compliance requirements, but to know that those individuals, given their elevated privileges, could not conduct an attack on systems that are not related to their role, or even systems that are related to their role. These are things that need to be tested. So I just highlight that trusted third parties as a kind of a information or understanding gap within the industry, is that those parties are just as important to test their roles and how those roles could be exploited to gain elevated privileges and to launch an attack, as we've actually seen in the industry here over the last 12 to 24 months. And then I also want to draw attention to the idea of malicious versus also non-malicious insiders. So an insider is an employee generally, and those insiders or trusted individuals may not be malicious themselves. Certainly that is a threat, but where a non-malicious insider could be exploited to either through social engineering or spear phishing to give access to a malicious outsider, that non-malicious insider becomes part of the attack vector and therefore part of the adversary. Or they may be coerced or perform or simply perform activities that are unauthorized, thereby jeopardizing and creating risk. Say as not monitoring a fuel controller for exceptions or not reporting incidents. Those activities could pose a threat to the organization. And of course, as we talked about earlier, both the exfiltration of data as well as the destruction of data, these could be things we don't see as much today, but we may be seeing an increased amount of attacks on enterprises, retail operations, as well as corporate environments, where the goal is really not to take the data out of the environment at all. We've definitely seen that with crypto ransomware, where the profit motivation kind of went through a paradigm shift. Rather than trying to steal the credit card data and make out with it, thereby bypassing any data loss prevention systems that might detect the card data leaving the environment, they simply encrypt it wherever it sits, and then of course extort Bitcoin or other valuable payment for decryption of that data. So theft of property, physical destruction, contamination could be an issue, especially where you're looking at risks that are maybe not related to the credit card transaction, but related to the actual fuel itself, or some other attack that may ultimately either damage property, jeopardize human life, or cause ultimately causing brand damage and loss of revenue. Another important thing to really touch on is the difference between vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. So again, without spending too much time, we'll provide this deck to all attendees as Cara mentioned, but a vulnerability assessment is one part of a penetration test, or it could be a standalone activity for vulnerability management where you're conducting automated tests using technical tools. These are limited, of course, in that they are generally only able to identify known vulnerabilities. Whereas a penetration tester, this is a multidimensional attack. As we'll talk about in a moment, they are able to move laterally within the organization as soon as they've identified a threat or some sort of it's not a threat, but a vulnerability. And these are experts that can use human thinking skills to bypass security controls. Whereas an automated tool may only look for known vulnerabilities without really discovering or exploiting any flaws. The scope is generally limited for vulnerability assessments to systems with either credentialed or non-credentialed access. And the goal is to really produce just a technical report. It may have some tactical recommendations, but generally it's looking at a risk rating associated with known vulnerabilities and then where those vulnerabilities exist. Whereas with penetration testing, the objective is clearly stated and it may vary from scenario to scenario. In some cases, that may be to, as I mentioned earlier, exfiltrate data. It may be to simply gain access to certain systems, or it may be to affect some sort of change into an environment or configuration. And then, of course, the scope may vary from engagement to engagement in terms of the time allocated and level of effort. But really, the goal here is not just to identify the vulnerabilities, but take those findings and remediate those issues, which is a much more extensive and higher level perspective on the security, because many of those flaws may be an interrelationship between multiple systems and not just one system that has a known vulnerability, but when in a configured state, how do those systems play together and how could they be compromised based on misconfiguration, et cetera. So I know I've been doing a lot of talking, so I want to pull John in. John, as we go through this, I think the basic concepts here as we talk about your activity as a penetration tester is how do you as an attacker really visualize an environment and then model a threat. Here, I guess I'll go over this real quick to kind of give us some context where each step in the kill chain is a kind of a common model that we use to visualize an attack, where the first step is reconnaissance. Recon allows an attacker like John to really figure out how he's going to go about his kind of plan his day, so to speak. Is there information about an organization exposed on the internet? am I able to go out and using Google or maybe physical reconnaissance determine that there are systems that I think I can target? So walking into a convenience store and seeing that it's using a particular brand of controller, or a particular brand of point of sale system or device, this is valuable information. Of course, often can't be stopped. You certainly can't, lock the doors to prevent the attacker from getting this information. But it's good to know what information is out there and available, because that's what a penetration tester is going to do. They're going to act like that adversary. They're going to get access to the same information and then utilize it. The next step is weaponizing, which is where you generally are taking, so say you've identified a possible vector and you want to try to create a malware that a particular piece of executable code that you think will be able to exploit a network, or rather execute the arbitrary code that you're intending to perform inside that system. Delivering that takes on many shapes and forms. That could be a physical USB drive that's dropped on the parking lot and hoping that an unsuspecting employee will plug that into a sensitive system, or it could be actually pushing that code into the web application, or using buffer overflow by creating a message that overflows the bounds of a particular expected length field, and thereby execute that code that you've weaponized into the memory space of that system. So John, maybe talk through the rest of this. When you've performed an exploit, how do you go about installing and then gaining command and control over that system?
Sure thing. That sounds good. So after the first three steps in this kill chain are performed, the recon, weaponization, and delivery, then we go ahead and exploit that vulnerability. After we exploit the vulnerability using either code that we've written or publicly accessible code, then we go ahead and try to install our own command and control modules upon the network so that we can do things such as exfiltrate data, further pivot through the network, escalate privileges, basically see how far we can get within a client's environment.
Perfect. And so, from our perspective, as we're trying to, number one, understand your role, but also defend against both, you, because our goal really would be to get a clean bill of health, as it were, is this idea of defense in depth. So talk about how, at each stage of this chain, you encounter, roadblocks that maybe if you get past the delivery stage, you're unable to fully exploit a vulnerability. Maybe speak to that just for a moment.
Sure thing. So a good example of this would be the first step in that kill chain, the recon. So a lot of times if we're doing a red team type of a scenario where we're targeting a company, the first thing that we're going to do is gather as much information about the company as we can. Now, the more information that's publicly accessible about the company, the larger the attack surface grows for said company. A good example is listing employees on LinkedIn. So if we can gain the format of an email address used by a company, such as firstname.lastname@xcompany.com, then we can use techniques such as scrolling through LinkedIn, gathering a list of a couple hundred different employees' names, and now we have a couple hundred different email addresses, which we can target with social engineering attack, spear phishing, things of that nature. So that's one way that recon really helps us to do that. And prevention on the amount of information that's publicly available is usually a huge roadblock. If we can't find very much information about which employees work for the company, things of that nature, then that decreases the attack surface area a lot. Another large one, moving on to this middle one, the exploit step of the kill chain. A lot of times just up-to-date systems and up-to-date software can really stop us in our tracks. All too often, our main foothold on a network is an out-of-date piece of software which multiple vulnerabilities exist in and multiple exploits exist for. So keeping your software up to date is usually a large defense against malicious attackers.
Excellent. Yeah, and it sounds like really the best answer for most organizations is to not just focus on any one link in this chain. Now, as John said, I mean, if you kill one link, you may defeat an attack. but you're never sure exactly what approach they're going to take. So having that defense in depth strategy where you don't focus all of your efforts on one aspect of the larger kill chain is definitely appropriate. So you mentioned pivoting, John. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, about how a common attack may take place and how it may move from one kill chain to the next.
Sure thing. So we can go ahead and use the example of a company's public-facing website for an example of pivoting here. So let's imagine that we have a targeted company that has a public website which contains a vulnerability because they haven't updated their software in X amount of years. So if we go ahead and exploit that vulnerability upon the website and we gain remote code execution upon their network, then we can go ahead and loop back through this kill chain and take a look at all the other computers on their network, further exploit them, and just kind of dig our way around the network in hopes to find sensitive information, potentially the CDE, things of that nature. Basically seeing how far within the network we can get, how much data we can gather, and how much potential destruction could be caused.
Absolutely. Yeah, so like when you're there and you're enumerating systems wherever you have that command and control, that's kind of a form of recon, right? So you're like reconning the next layer of the organization, which may be, using a port scanner or something like that to find out what you now have access to, right?
Exactly, yes. And one of the things that helps to defend against this is just a great up-to-date firewall. Like you said, it's predominantly recon once we gain the initial foothold on the network, and a good firewall that does things such as, drops packets and stuff when you're trying to scan nearby hosts, can largely help with this.
Makes sense. Awesome. So as we go through kind of some of these types of penetration tests, and this is where I think hopefully you'll find some value, is I've taken the kill chain, I've kind of highlighted. This isn't to say that each of these individual types of a penetration test activity are confined within this area, but maybe it's targeted to that. So social engineering, we've already talked about a little bit. John used a great example about using LinkedIn to recon, and then to use that recon information about an organization's users to attempt to manipulate those users. Social engineering usually takes on one of two types. You're usually either trying to get them to divulge information directly to you, or you're trying to get an individual, a human person, to perform some sort of an action that will give you command and control. And that's done through influencing them through social engineering. So like phishing is a form of social engineering where you're giving them something that looks to be appropriate or from an official source, and really you're not necessarily wanting them to reply to you and give you that information, their username and password. Perhaps you're wanting them to click a link that gives them that takes them to an internal web application where you formulated some sort of a cross-site script attack to maybe compromise that application on your behalf. So I think we've got I don't have a demo. I don't have an example of that, John. Are there any kind of social engineering attacks like the one I just described that spring to mind that you'd want to share?
Sure. One that springs to mind would specifically be that casino job that was previously referenced and maybe referenced later. Would you like me to speak about that one now or on the next slide?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I think I've got that in
already.
But go for it.
Sure thing. So once upon a time, a casino out west contracted Coalfire to go ahead and perform a social engineering attack on them. And we started out with basically no information on how to get into their network. So what we did is utilize the LinkedIn trick, just gathered a whole bunch of lists of employees, their email addresses, things of that nature. From there, we started gathering phone numbers. And that's when we realized that the social engineering will be our main point of entry into this casino. So we started by just giving them a phone call. My main goal was to try to reach the head of security so that I can gain an understanding of their voice and their mannerisms so that I can go ahead and try to mimic it next time I call back. Though when we spoke to them, we actually thought of a different scenario. We were posing as a nearby casino, one of their neighbors, and told them that we've recently had a large security threat, that we have pictures of these individuals who just breached us, and that we would like to notify all these surrounding casinos of what just happened so that they can be on the lookout for these individuals. So the head of security was thrilled to hear about this information sharing, thinking that, somebody was coming to target them. And so I said, hey, can I, go ahead and send you this email? It contains the pictures of them. It does have macros enabled for reasons X, Y, and Z. So just go ahead and enable them, run it, and the pictures will load up. So she was happy to receive the information. We sent her the email. She opened it up, downloaded it, and right when she downloaded that attachment, their network was compromised. And then we further pivoted through it, and we won. So that's one example of how somebody can fall victim to a social engineering attack and get their entire network compromised. You can just think of any random story that might be believable, and that could be the end.
Wow, incredible. So social engineering is definitely a kind of an important part of that recon, getting privileged users or even non-privileged users within the environment to create a narrative that you can then leverage for additional pivoting. So network testing is, I think, another really common form of penetration testing. We talked about that from a PCI compliance standpoint. The main goals here are to emulate that anonymous threat, both from across the internet as well as internal adversaries on an internal network segment. So both those are very important. And again, the credentials of the network user could vary between the different attacks. We'll talk again about scoping an engagement and how you go about creating the threat scenario to determine how best to configure the scenario. But the attack surface here for network testing is generally going to be operating systems, as well as the network infrastructure itself, and then any commercial off-the-shelf products that are known. So we're using known vulnerabilities to conduct a network attack. So I think you mentioned one to me earlier, John, this MS17010. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure thing. So usually when we're doing network penetration tests, a couple vulnerabilities tend to pop up more than others. One that's been popping up as of late is this vulnerability MS17010. It's a vulnerability within the SMB protocol, and it's rather prevalent on a lot of networks. And this was also the same vulnerability that many ransomwares, such as the infamous WannaCry, were utilizing. They would pack up MS17010 and just target all networks, and it was unfortunately successful in many of the cases. So yes, a lot of times when we do these network penetration tests, we go ahead and we scan all of the hosts on the network, see which vulnerabilities are there, such as MS17010. We go ahead and exploit them. And as you can see here on the screen, we can use tools such as Metasploit to go ahead and gain a shell on the system. The shell is basically a command prompt that's returned back to you on the other computer. So as you can see here, we're running a Kali Linux-based operating system. We go ahead and we launch the exploit, and we're returned with a shell providing full control of the victim's computer.
Oh, wow. So that Windows system prompt, that's the actual prompt there on what must be a Windows system that you've now gained command and control of. Is that correct?
That's correct. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, cool. So now wireless testing, that's kind of a form of network testing or network penetration testing. It sounds like the main goals here would be to maybe physically on site there at the environment, capture some of the critical packet exchange during that handshake, and then to crack that authentication. So maybe you can talk about some of the vulnerabilities there that would be present in an environment that's using wireless for some of their maybe controllers or even interfacing with the customers in the retail environment.
Sure thing. So typically for these wireless penetration tests, we'll generally show up on site with a specialized antenna that we just plug into our computers. It does things such as packet injection, which can knock computers off of the wireless connection. once they try to re-authenticate with the Wi-Fi, we can go ahead and we capture that handshake. Once we capture the handshake, we can do an offline attack, just a typical brute force attack, and try to crack the password. So WPA2 in itself is, I don't want to say a flawed protocol, but it is susceptible to these handshakes being captured. The main point of entry when these are captured are generally weak passwords. So the weaker the password is, the faster it's going to crack. You can have a really strong password and it'll take hundreds of thousands of years to crack. But if you have a really weak password, sometimes it can be cracked in 5 minutes. And what's showing on the screen right now is an example of one of the programs that we use most often, the AirCrack suite. And shown here is it just capturing a handshake and performing a dictionary-based attack, cracking the key. And as we can see here, the key's been found.
Very cool. I certainly wouldn't want that to happen. Of course, you know, maybe a guest network might have a relatively soft password, but once you have access to that unauthorized network, or perhaps to a network that's not part of the CDE, I imagine then the goal would be to move laterally through that kind of beachhead into by exploiting you know, any weak firewalls and things of that nature, right?
Exactly. That's usually what we do once the password's cracked. We can also do things such as perform man-in-the-middle attacks and go ahead and sniff all of the traffic going to and fro across the network, and typically gain a lot of sensitive information doing that as well.
Gotcha. So another penetration test type is application and API tests. Now these are also required under PCI. So we see these a lot from merchants where they're using an application that may not be a PADSS application, or where the PADSS vendor has to perform their own application vulnerabilities assessment. So in this case, I think we're again emulating a threat with either credentialed or uncredentialed adversaries, and then focusing on that application as the attack surface. So I think you wanted to talk a little bit maybe about Burp Suite as one possible tool that you've used to kind of perform some of these application layer attacks.
Sure thing, yes. So yeah, as you mentioned, typically when we're doing web application-based or API-based penetration tests, we utilize tools here such as Burp Suite Pro, which has a really great built-in automated scanner. It does things such as first spidering the website, getting a list of every single valid link, directory, things of that nature, and then it goes ahead and scans it for known vulnerabilities. As we can see here on the screen, it found SQL injection, cross-site scripting, stored and reflected, and clear text submission path. Just a bunch of vulnerabilities on this one. Not a good web app. And once these are found, we typically go in manually and both validate these to make sure that they actually exist, because a lot of times these automated scanners throw off false positives. And so we need to go in to make sure that they actually exist, they're a real threat, and then we proceed to exploit them. Once we exploit them, then we can go further into the network or application to simulate what an actual attacker would do once he got past the first layer.
Gotcha. Yep. So this is not an end-all be-all. This is really just a tool that gives you some intel that you would then use to further exploit the application or network. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. This is mostly, I would say, even part of the reconnaissance phase, and then we manually go in and validate and exploit.
Makes sense. So this, I think I was real fascinated to hear this story. So I'll let you share the story about a fuel controller that you were able to exploit using some application penetration testing that may be relevant for some of the folks that are here from the petroleum and retail fuel industry.
Sure thing. So this was a large-scale fuel controller that was found previously. It had a user interface that was browser-based. There were multiple things wrong with this. The first point being that tools such as Burp Suite Pro or NetSparker or any other automated scanner wouldn't have even found these vulnerabilities in the first place, since it requires mostly manual testing of this. Now, the first thing that we noticed when we went ahead and we accessed the user interface for this controller was that it provided us with instant guest level access, which was not good at all, because then we had access to sensitive information. We could control a few things, not too many, but still not good. From there was another vulnerability which existed. Every time we made a certain request to a certain element, a certain key was returned. Now that key, when you do some fancy encryption on it, return it back, which you see here in the middle, we're just encrypting it with 2 A's, send it back. That becomes the new password for the diagnostic user on this fuel controlling system. So basically we can crack the password of the system admin pretty much, but this guy has more privileges than the system admin. From there, we have full control over this system. We can do things such as view the fuel levels in tanks, the temperature. We can turn on and off sensors, alarms, things of that nature, just all around not good. There were also more vulnerabilities found within here where we can there was a local file inclusion vulnerability, which means that we can go ahead and download files from the host that is hosting this interface. So we can go ahead and download their Etsy password file, things of that nature. There was also a RFI vulnerability, which allowed us to gain remote code execution. Pretty much we could utilize this interface to go ahead and upload a payload, and we had full control over the entire system. I think that the most scary thing about this was that it's public facing, and things such as Shodan, which you can utilize to go around and find out every single instance on the internet where these things exist, they're out there, and that's just a little terrifying. So that's one example of what we can do here with manual testing.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that reporting that is a part of what we do as an organization, and you've done that by reporting those 0 days. And so just to kind of, clarify, our role is not to, throw anybody into the bus. It's really about security across the industry. And so we share these only after we have, reported the vulnerabilities to the vendors. And so that's, again, how our labs team operates. And so when we talk about, in testing embedded systems, IoT, I know we're running kind of short on time, so I may go through a few of these a little more quickly. But in a fuel retail environment, we've got to, of course, pay attention to things like those fuel controllers that could be vulnerable and expose a vector into the network for an attacker. Same thing goes with car washes. I think you had mentioned that we've actually, we're able to compromise a car wash system. Maybe tell us a little bit about that.
Sure thing. So one of the tests that we were engaged on very recently, actually, had to do with appliance testing, as mentioned here, where basically we had physical access to a car wash. Now, the tester in question went ahead and found a buffer overflow vulnerability within the appliance and was able to literally control all of the moving parts within the car wash, which is, again, a little scary to think about.
Wow. Yeah. So they were able to take over the mechanics of the moving parts and using that buffer overflow and arbitrary code execution. And these are the types of things that, certainly, again, a skilled penetration tester would be able to focus on by looking at other things beyond just the cardholder data environment. Now, red teaming is focused specifically on people, processes, and technologies. So the idea of the red team is, red team, blue team, right? So we've got the penetration testers, the adversary emulation team would be the adversary. And then there would also be a blue team. Now, the blue team would be the enterprise threat response team. This would be your SOC or your on-site personnel. And the real goal here is not to test all the actual security controls. It's really about seeing how the threat is perceived and how your internal monitoring and notification systems would then respond and ultimately detect the threat. So I think this is the casino that we talked about earlier. Obviously, it had a combination of both red team attack as well as social engineering. But the goal there, from a red teaming perspective, is seeing how the security team would have responded had they known that this threat existed, but ultimately, resulted in a successful attack due to improper, threat detection on their side. Now, reverse engineering. I know you've done some of your own code here. Maybe you can speak to the application that you developed here for reverse engineering.
Sure thing. So what's shown here on the screen is just a quick and dirty example of what reverse engineering can do. So at the bottom left screenshot, we went ahead and just wrote a quick little C program where when you input a number, it will tell you whether the number is even or odd. So we can fire up a program such as Radari2 or IDA Pro. We can go ahead and find the logic within the code that has to deal with determining whether it is indeed an odd or an even number, and we can change that. We can change it in a way so that every time that you enter in the number 2, it'll say it's odd, even though it's even. Now, this can be applicable to things such as an authentication system. So if there was a certain program that was like, hey, enter in your password here, and then we're going to grant you access. If we had access to the binary and we were able to find this logic and a couple key vulnerabilities occurred, we may be able to actually change that logic and bypass it completely. Now, there's other defenses in place, such as stripping symbols is one of them, things of that nature, stack canaries that can go ahead and prevent this, but it is possible. It is possible.
Right, so an application developer may look at a reverse engineering penetration test engagement or utilizing a penetration tester to see if their stack canaries and other defense mechanisms would be adequate to defend against this sort of a reverse engineering attack. Is that a good example of someone who might be someone who may be interested in reverse engineering as far as a testing activity?
Very much so. Very much so, yes. I would say that this specific type of penetration test would be most valuable for an application developer, whether mobile or web.
Gotcha. Excellent. And then finally, I think hunt operations and enterprise, these are where we actually go in and look for either adversaries already on a network. In the case of hunt operations, where we actually act as more of an investigator to determine whether any of those existing, because the reality is some of these attacks can take a while to perform. And if there are individuals who have already gained command and control within maybe a less sensitive area of the organization, they ultimately may be able to bring their attack to full fruition over time. And then finally, enterprise testing, where we combine many of these individual processes into a larger program that we can use to test all aspects of the enterprise. Now, again, each of these particular activities are not ideal for every organization. For instance, denial of service is a very difficult threat to respond to, but it also has, based on relatively low risk, it's often overlooked. However, with modern organizations and with the advent of more botnet type denial of services, these have grown in regularity as well as threat level, especially where you have critical infrastructure, which may be severely hampered by a denial of service. So again, I'll provide access to this, but this is a good model, not just for cold fire activities, but for any penetration testing activity, to really match the type of threat that's being tested against which aspects of the organization you're really trying to target. For instance, compliance versus actual physical environment. So your physical environments are best tested by either a red team or an enterprise scale attack. Some other misconceptions we'd want to address briefly on penetration testing, or considerations, I should say. Every penetration test will have impact on your organization. So that's the goal. The goal is to impact it. It's to make sure that logs are generated, make sure that a SOC is actually notified, new traffic is introduced, and notifications are generated. So impact is a desired outcome from testing activities. However, disruption is not. Obviously, it's impossible to simulate a full attack on a development environment. So a good penetration tester, as you're seeking out an organization or an individual who can perform these activities, will be very tactful in terms of being able to help you test your vulnerabilities without impacting, or rather without disrupting day-to-day business operations. Now, some of that can be addressed through timing, creating a time window, doing tests after hours or at low peak times. These are all, of course, part of the structure of a scope that would help to reduce the possibility of disruption to the organization. As well as the timing also comes into play when defining the time box for the activity. How long are we going to spend before we admit that we've come up empty? These are goals that are defined up front so that you don't end up spinning your wheels, and you also don't end up quitting too early before an actual threat may have been identified. Methodology is a key consideration. As I mentioned earlier, the many phases of an attack, some of the most important are the post-exploitation phase. How is the methodology dictate how the report will be generated, what remediation activities are going to be recommended, and how is this information delivered and to whom? As well as the importance of following industry standard methodology, especially as it pertains to the compliance frameworks like PCI. Again, target and scope. First, identifying those risks through the risk assessment process, as we talked about at the top of the hour, but also recognizing which attack surfaces are most important to test, which vectors should we simulate, and which scenarios are we going to try to emulate. As well as making sure that the scope is defined to include prior notification or not. If you're testing your security team's ability to respond, it may be appropriate not to notify the security team that a test is getting ready to kick off. Whereas if you're testing your employee responses at the lower level, it's definitely helpful to notify and keep everyone in the loop so that they don't disrupt the intended outcomes. Skill set is super important. I'll provide this as kind of a reference guide. These are a number of the certifications. They range from entry level, such as Certified Ethical Hacker, all the way to some of the more involved, such as the Offensive Security Certified Expert, of which John is one, as well as Licensed Penetration Testing Masters, the LPT credential, based on the various agencies that provide these certifications. So if you're looking to have access to someone who can perform these activities, definitely check out the certifications, as well as performing the necessary background checks, and they have the appropriate security and system level knowledge. So I think with that, and I know we've run our time almost to the ground. I'll turn it back over to Cara and Ali, and we'll see where we need to go from here.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. That was a ton of great information. And I think, as we can see, penetration is quite extensive if you're going to do it the right way and to find some potential vulnerabilities, because we'd rather find them during the penetration testing than be found. So yeah, it's quite amazing. I know of a smaller marketer that is multi-branded, and they just did not have the proper security precautions in place, and had their corporate data encrypted and held for ransomware, not once but twice. And so you think it can't even happen at the smaller level and of a group of distributor that has about 50 stores. And so it's quite amazing. So it's important that you do that. And we know that is penetration testing is also one of the more costlier parts of the compliance piece, but it definitely is worth it, because you'd rather pay for the penetration testing than have to pay for the ransomware or even worse than that. So we do thank you for that. A couple of questions is, what would be the proper fix for the demonstrated tank monitoring vulnerability?
Sure, I can go ahead and answer that one. So the first fix would be not exposing it publicly to the internet. That's a very large attack surface that's best left internal rather than publicly facing. The second fix would be to not return with the diagnostic user's password in the HTTP response. We don't really see a need for that anyways, so it's very odd that it's doing that in the first place. And then the last and final fix for both the remote file inclusion vulnerability as well as the local file inclusion vulnerability would be proper bounds checking as well as code sanitization to ensure that we can't grab files from the hosting operating system nor upload malicious files of our own.
Sure. Can you get to the CVE from the field controller?
Theoretically, we may be able to. So that will depend on if their network is segmented properly. This should not be hosted on the CDE network. If it is, then we would have gained a shell directly upon the CDE. If this were not within the CDE, then it would depend on how their network is segmented. If it's segmented properly, then we would not be able to reach the CDE. If proper network segmentation was not being practiced, then we would be able to hit it.
Sure, sure. And sometimes in the petroleum industry, a site controller is also the fuel controller, or there could be two separate units. So just be cognizant of what you had just reiterated there. Sam, are level 4 merchants now required to have penetration testing performed yearly?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So the level 4 requirement now is for individual merchants to attest their compliance to their acquirer. Now, each individual merchant could have different requirements based on the types of systems that they have in place. So 11.3 is not applicable for certain systems that are either making use of only point-to-point encryption or making only use of PTS standalone devices, to name a couple. Or you could, certainly anytime you can fully outsource your credit card processing, but then again, at that point, you probably don't fall into the category that you're describing. Check with your acquirer just to confirm. Every acquirer manages their own PCI compliance process, and they may have relaxed requirements, or they may be able to provide a substitution in the form of a compensating control. So level 4s, this could be definitely something that could affect them because of the requirement now to be compliant. It's not necessarily that this is a new control requirement for those merchants. It's only that Visa and the other card brands are now requiring each of these merchants to be compliant, whereas before there was more of a backseat that they were taking to level 4s.
Yeah. I kind of coined that to be that you've always had to be PCI compliant, but now you're required to validate and show proof upon request. So
exactly.
There are no further questions, and so, gentlemen, we want to thank you again for your time today and for sharing your expertise and all of some of that scary stuff as well. So it's quite daunting when you hear about it. So, all right, I'm going to give just a reminder that the Conexxus website is www.conexxus.org, and that this webinar will be posted on YouTube in approximately 30 days and also at the Conexxus website. Next slide.
That's it.
And that's it. Perfect. All right. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.